Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? You know, I'm sure the parents are trying to say, hey, wake up. Come on now. Let me slap some sense into you. Yeah. Well, you know, just sometimes, you know, you do what you can do. Then you have to let them make their own choices, eh? Yeah. Yeah. Gibbs, right?
Yep, Gibbs.
Well, they were aware, Samson's parents were aware that God's commandments were, and they tried to instruct him not to marry this Philistine woman. But Samson answers in verse 3, get her for me, she's right. She's the right one for me. Shows that the last thing on his mind was God's commandment. That's it. I don't care what God says. I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to do what I want.
Wrong.
You know? Yeah, and I think, you know, there are people like that today. You mean, you know that they're, from an outside perspective, looking at that their situation is not right. But they do it. Well, it's okay, you know. I'm going to do it anyway because God will bless it anyway. And usually that doesn't happen. Well, the New Testament scripture, I couldn't help but think with this, also teaches this principle about being married to unbelievers, or unequally yoked, as we call it. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians and told them, says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. Right? And again, I think Samson has got this on his mind. He didn't care about anything that the Word of God says. And, you know, there are people like that today. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what does righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? What does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. And hey, these are clear instructions that God gives us today that we are to obey. And if we just say, oh, well, God doesn't really mean that, and then we go ahead and do it, then we're just kind of asking for trouble. And I think this is what's happening with Samson. Now, so what? I don't care what God says. I'm going to do it anyway. And we know through our study of Samson that he is on a downward spiral in his life. Because he's doing what he wants, regardless of what anybody else thinks. Second, the will of God is overruled. In Samson's case, he was sitting on the throne of his heart rather than on the Lord sitting there, right? In other words, he was controlling himself, and God had no control over him whatsoever. He didn't care. He was living by the lust of the flesh rather than the law of the Lord. And when it came to what he did, he was not controlled by God, and what God wanted in his life was overruled by what Samson wanted. When Samson said to his parents, get her for me, she was right one for me, what Samson was really saying or meant in this verse, for she is right in my eyes. And over again in the book of Judges we read, every man did that which was right in their own eyes, or everyone did as they saw fit. And I think that's what's going on today. I mean, we just talked about, well, what was that day you called today?
420.
420?
Yeah.
I mean, come on, you know, what kind of stuff is that? I never heard of such a thing. Everybody's doing what's right in their own mind or in their own eyes, you know? Well, but Samson was no different. Samson was not concerned with what was right in God's eyes. All he cared again about was what was right in his own eyes. He was so infatuated with sin that he thinks of nothing but fulfilling his own desires. And infatuation with sin is always the case where one is letting God is overruled in their lives. Next, what I want you to see is not only that Samson's infatuation with sin, but also Samson's indulgence in sin. In verse 10 through 11 we read, now his father went down to see the woman, and Samson made a feast there, as was customary for bridegrooms. When he appeared, he was given 30 companions. Now, the setting is a feast. It is a wedding feast. Okay? That's where I get the feast thing there, okay? In these verses we read that Samson's father went down to see the woman while Samson prepares a feast to celebrate the wedding that is about to take place with the Timnite woman. Okay? And during that time it was customary for the wedding feast to last several days. Verse 12 suggests that the wedding feast lasted 7 days. This is a long party. Okay?
Yeah, it is.
Okay? This is not just a one-time party event. This is a blowout. It's an all-out festival, if you will. Now, this act seems innocent enough, in a sense. Yeah, I mean, he's happy. He's getting married. And most people, whenever they get married, they call all their family and relatives and stuff like that to be there so they can have a good time, celebrate, right? But this act, again, it seems innocent enough until you realize that the word for feast in the context refers to a 7-day drinking bout at the home of the bride's parents. Why? You know, most people, when you have a wedding celebration, there's a lot of booze flowing around. Yeah, right.
Booze.
Well, but for Samson, this is a problem.
Supposed to be drinking it.
This is a problem, right? And again, what we call this situation today is a bachelor party.
Right.
That's in our day. That's what we'd say. And again, no doubt, man, they're having a good time, drinking and having a blast. I mean, 7 days. Talk about a drunken stupor. I'm sure a lot of them were.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. There is no doubt in my mind that Samson participated in this week-long feast, indulging himself in the consumption of wine. And it was the law that the Nazarite we read about in the Old Testament book of Numbers, that they must abstain from wine or fermented drink, and must not drink vinegar made from wine or from other fermented drink. He must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins. As long as he is a Nazarite, he must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. But here again, you get the idea. This is a great big bash, and I'm sure Samson's enjoying himself. Yeah. And again, it appears that this is one more element of Samson's Nazarite vow that he broke and that he indulged in. His indulgence in his sin is not only the setting of the feast, but also the surrounding of the feast. We want to talk about. Verse 11 says that he was given 30 companions. The normal custom for these marriage festivals or festivities was to be held at the home of the bridegroom. It was normal for friends of the bridegroom to have been invited to participate in the feast. In Samson's case, he's celebrating his marriage not in his home or among his own people, but in an area occupied by pagan Philistines. I mean, he doesn't have any of his relatives there. I mean, maybe his parents might have been there. It doesn't say that, but it appears that he's surrounded himself by his enemy. Instead of Jewish friends being invited, there were 30 Philistines that were brought to the wedding as guests. Instead of surrounding that reflected his people, his faith, or even his God, his marriage feast reflects more of a place and people that did not know God. I mean, this is a sad commentary again on Samson's life. Remember, he was to be separated. He was to live a Nazarite, as a Nazarite. Both his conduct and his companions are inappropriate of one who knows God. He had been raised up to deliver the children of Israel from the Philistines, not to become part of them. And again, I can't help but think, have you ever been around people, whenever they talk to you one-on-one, they act one way, and then whenever they get among a crowd, they act totally different? You're thinking, wow, what happened? I'm sure this is exactly what's happened with Samson, right? I mean, although he seems to be kind of a jerk at all the times. You know, I mean, but still, I know people that do that quite often. You know, they'll talk to you. They'll talk to you about religion, and they'll talk to you about God or Jesus Christ. And boy, whenever they get over in this other crowd, man, all kinds of profanity comes out, and they, wow, man, that conversation I had didn't do any good, did it? So, well, that's the way life is sometimes. What we see in Samson's life is more than a failure, but a constant life of failure. We see more than a moment of weakness, but a pattern of weakness. It is more than a one-time mistake in his life. It is developed into indulgence in sin. And again, the story of sin is always the same. You yield to sin the first time, and it is easier to surrender the next time to sin. Sin leads to one sin or another. Warren Wiersbe says in his commentary that these men may have served as guards for the Philistines because Samson's reputation had preceded him, and they were never sure what he would do next. Yeah, I mean, Samson is probably that unpredictable. Right? Samson's infatuation and indulgence in sin is sad, but there is even a more tragic element to what Samson is doing. Now we notice of Samson's indifference to sin. Again, the main focus of verses 10 through 14 is the riddle that Samson gave to his wedding guests. Again, Warren Wiersbe says in his commentary, since the atmosphere must have been tense at the beginning of the feast, Samson sought to liven things up by posing a riddle. And in verse 12 through 14, we read the content of the riddle. He said, let me tell you the riddle. Samson said to them, if you could tell me the answer within 7 days of the feast, this is 7 days of the wedding party, right? I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you could tell me the answer, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes and tell us the riddle. They said, let us hear it. And he replied, out of the eater, something to eat, out of the strong, something sweet. We're losing? Again? Well, Samson's riddle was short and enigmatic. The riddle was told in a way that the answer was hidden from them. Of course, that's the way riddles are, right? And of course, as Jim said earlier, his riddle was based on the lion he had killed and how he had found the bees storing honey in the carcass. But again, we have the privilege of knowing what went on before Samson told this riddle to these guests. But this is hardly the statement of a spirit-filled man, but in fact seems more like a type of wager one would hear from the lips of a man that has had too much to drink. In other words, Samson was probably a little tipsy or a little drunk whenever he come up with this riddle. I mean, as you ponder the record of Samson's life, you get the impression that he was a fun-loving guy with a good sense of humor. And I have known people like that, man. You know, you go to the bar and boy, they just get a few drinks and man, oh man, they're the life of the party. Right? Well, and sometimes, well, a sense of humor is a good thing to have. Nothing wrong with a good sense